Are we good?
Yeah,
Lord Nesson, you are our timekeeper.
It's Siman Lahachil.
Okay. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
It's so fabulous to be with you on this Shabbat Shira. So let's first begin by thanking Hashem for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyah anachnu v'tzatza'enu v'tzatza'ei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yod'ei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah la'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. V'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah. So, Shabbat Shalom, so fabulous to be with all of you this morning. Just an FYI, our beloved Elias is in Buenos Aires. He is with his mother. So we're sending lots of love to Elias and his family in Argentina. And it's also Shabbat Shira, a very special festive song. So, Eliza, can you give us a sneak peek of coming attractions at our special Shabbat Shira service?
I can. We're going to be doing all sorts of fabulous, fun melodies. And I was thinking we're going to do this at the end. One we're going to do is going to be Baruch She'amar. Da-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na, Baruch She'amar ve'oseh b'reishit. All of the prayers will be sung to specific melodies that have been chosen for their themes and for their musicality. Join us in a few minutes as we get to sing together for Shabbat Shira. Yes.
Thank you. Look forward to that. So, in our class this morning, kind of as a complement to the Shabbat Shira theme, we wanted to shine the light on three women who are kind of the protagonists of the Haftarah that we read this time here. And here's how I wanted to frame our class. When we encounter a prophet, and the first person we're going to encounter is the prophet Deborah. When we encounter Isaiah, we know what we need to do to be like Isaiah. We know what we need to do to heed Isaiah's message. You know, the most famous prophetic utterance of the year is the Haftarah for Yom Kippur. And Isaiah tells us, is this the fast that God wants, to starve your bodies? No, this is what God wants, to feed the hungry and to shelter the homeless and to unlock the fetters of wickedness, to use his prophetic language. So we know that if we want to be like Isaiah, then it's not enough to do right. This is an Abraham Joshua Heschelism. It's not enough to do right, R-I-T-E. That's fine. Fasting is fine. Praying is fine. But you also have to do right, R-I-G-H-T. That's the Isaiah move, okay? If I were to ask you what does it mean to be like Aaron, you know, it's to be a peacemaker, to try to create peaceful relations. So here's the frame that I want to offer us for these three characters. For Deborah, who's a prophetess, what do we do to be like Deborah? What's her move? It's not so clear what her move is, to be like Deborah. And then Yael kills a guy while he's sleeping. What's the move there? Like, what's the lesson? Would you teach this to your child? I mean, would you do this? What's the lesson? And then finally, the mother of Sisera, it really is an example of what not to do, but I think in many ways it's the most repercussive of all of the lessons. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is let's turn to just the beginning, chapter 4. And Eliza, would you mind just reading? There's very few verses with Deborah. She comes in and goes out. But if you could just read from verses 4 through 10, this is what the Bible has to say about the prophetess Deborah. How do we be like Deborah?
Deborah, wife of Lapidot, was a prophetess. She led Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah, between Ramah and Beth El in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites would come to her for decisions. She summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, of Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go march up to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun. And I will draw Sisera, Jabin's army commander, with his chariots and his troops towards you up to the Wadi Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hands. But Barak said to her, If you will go with me, I will not go.
No, I will go.
Sorry, I will go. Having major dyslexia, sorry. If you will go with me, I will go. But if not, I will not go. Very well, I will go with you, she answered. However, there will be no glory for you in the course you are taking, for then the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak then mustered Zebulun and Naphtali at Kadesh. 10,000 men marched up after him, and Deborah also went up with him.
Okay, so that's the Deborah story. By the way, there is a foreshadowing, a premonition, when she says, if you go, I will go with you. However, there will be no glory for you in the course you are taking. For then the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. That's a foreshadowing of Yael, which we'll get to. Okay? This is what we know about Deborah. So my question is, what makes her a prophetess? What's the lesson?
Well, it's totally unclear. I mean, it says that people came to her for decisions. It's also, I mean, it's to me, it's like super fascinating that in a period of time that was totally patriarchal, that we have a woman, that people would actually go to specifically, for whatever decisions needed to be made. It seemed like she was more like a shofet, like a judge. That people come to her. So that's actually quite interesting, though. And the fact that she's also a military leader, so that's she's actually rousing the military to action. That's also quite fascinating for this particular period of time, and how the other question is how she became. How she got to the point where she was that person, that she would sit by the tents, the people would come to her, with their queries, with their decisions to be made, and that she was considered someone that people would listen to. How did that happen? Did Lapidot have anything to do with that or not? Her husband, was there somebody famous? And the other question is, what is the palm of Devorah? Is that something that was Devorah really? Is it a name? Is it a place name? Is it both? And how does that work? So it's more questions than answers. I'm very good at questions.
So the Midrash
Yes.
has a field day with exactly the questions you just asked, Dan. Lapidot, interestingly, you would think that Devorah had gotten her name because of him, or that she had gotten her stature because of him, and there is some suggestion that there's some wealth that's there. But actually the Midrash says that Lapidot was so called because his wife Devorah made wicks for the tabernacle. Actually, that he got his name from her. He was the first, second gentleman here. And he, in a sense, there is this sense of leadership that emanates from her that absolutely is outside of the range of what one would have expected as we look back. But there's a fair amount of sexism here, don't worry, because her tree, the Midrash says, is because a woman is not allowed to be alone in a home with a man or indoors with a man, and therefore in order to give judgment she had to sit outside where everyone could see her, and therefore her palm tree was a sign of her virtue, that she was not cohabitating with anyone by giving judgment. But she's really fascinating in that she's actually compared to Hannah, who prays for herself at the temple, and who we have the entire idea of prayer, Jewish prayer, based on her, and seems to be a woman who, unlike many of our matriarchs, is not bound by the men in her life who define her, instead by her own power. But there's a fair amount of discomfort with her seeing and what she sees, and some suggestion that perhaps she has this mystic power, not only from God, but also in that feminine way that she sort of foreshadows. She has a vision of Yael ultimately killing Sisera, because she has a vision of Sisera's mother dying, and so there is some sort of mystical and a little bit frightened piece about Devorah.
Michelle, if I were to ask you this following simple question, what can you do to be like Devorah? What can I do to be like Devorah? What's the answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could answer that in 1,000 different ways. I mean, there's a little piece of Devorah that is so bound within her own system. You think of a second grader or something out on a playground, well, if you do this, then I'm going to get, and it's not going to be you. And then there's this big piece of Devorah that's so strong and so fearless, and go with me. Barak feels that he needs her, that she's a conduit to God and God's blessing. And he desperately needs her. And she says yes, but she also gives him some tough love in this. Like, yes, I will come with you, but I also need you to stand on your own, and there's something else that I expect of you. And she's a very complicated role model. I think you're right pointing out how do we be
get?
like Devorah is not an easy answer.
Elisa, you got anything?
I think one really interesting point of comparison between Devorah and the many of the other prophets we've studied together is that she doesn't rail on the people. She doesn't go to them. She doesn't make them wrong. She sits back and lets them come to her. And I think that's a really important, right? And even if, that may be for modesty, but even if it was for modesty, like she's not, and she also, we don't have any texts of her berating people. She's all about like hearing where people are at, responding to where people are at in the ways that make them feel like they love her and need her. It's a really different model of prophecy.
But she also owns her own awesomeness. And in fact, the Midrash winds up having a little bit of a trouble with this, that she's arrogant because she says, look at Devorah, right? And she owns that she has power.
So I want to come back to Dan's initial framing comment, which is incontrovertible, that she's a female prophet in a man's world. And as you were speaking, Dan, I was thinking about a fabulous revisionist history with Malcolm Gladwell that I heard like 4 years ago that I've always thought about. Here was his question, which is, why did Sammy Davis Jr., who is a black performer, why was he famously aligned with Richard Nixon? So much so that he spoke at Richard Nixon's Republican nominating convention in '72, even though it was well known that Richard Nixon had used lots of racial epithets and was not particularly supportive of the black community. And Sammy Davis Jr. really put himself out there, and it created a lot of distance between Sammy Davis Jr. and the rest of black America, that he so supported Richard Nixon. And what Malcolm Gladwell talks about is the dilemma of there not being a critical enough mass of people like you. And if you're a minority figure, if you're a woman in a man's world, but there's not enough women. If you're a black in a white world, but there's not enough black. And that when there's enough women, women have a voice. And when there's enough blacks, black have a voice. But Sammy Davis Jr. was a black man in a white world, and there wasn't critical mass, and so he had to be kind of servile and docile, etc. And he shows a lot of examples of this, that there's a particular conundrum to being in a leadership position, identified as a minority or kind of an outlier, and you don't have enough people like you, and so therefore you really have to kind of suppress your voice. This is a fabulous revisionist history, Malcolm Gladwell, why Sammy Davis Jr. supported Richard Nixon.
Wes, what are you suggesting she's suppressing?
No. So what I'm asking, here's my question is this an issue of, she seems to raise, there's no question she raises the issue of being a female prophetess in a man's world. I mean, there's how many are there? And I'm wondering if that creates any resonances, for female leadership today, or not. In other words, do you feel like, as rabbis in 2021, do you feel like that's not your issue? There's clearly a critical mass of women and women leadership, etc. And this was maybe a problem in the 70s, but it's not a problem in 2020. Or do you feel that you still can recognize some of Deborah's issue, that it's mostly a male leadership world, and here she is functioning as a female prophet? Just asking.
So one question I have, I mean, it's hard to know whether our texts are representative of what the world looked like, or whether it's representative of what the men who wrote it and who shaped it wanted that world to look like. So it feels to me like we have her story because she participated in a military battle in a way that couldn't be written out. But I have all sorts of questions about the ways in which women were influential and were participating in leadership positions in society. And as for what I think the different, your example is someone who subverts real racism and ignores racism in a way to be a part of. I mean, that it also has all sorts of elements of caste and of Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, and thinking about getting power by glomming onto the dominant caste rather than by sticking to a lower subordinate caste. I don't necessarily see that in this text, because she's not, if she was walking in the coattails of a dominant caste man, if she was like Barak's crony, then I could see her being, maybe she's subverting her own feminine power, and she's not actually retelling her visions, she's making him retell them, and she's like so modest, but she's not doing that. She's just within the limitations of her world. She's participating fully, and to an extent that it upsets certain people.
And in fact, it's an inversion, because the general comes to her, and she bosses around the general.
Right, and it's completely and totally authentic. Like, she has this spiritual vision that she is giving to a people who are desiring that vision. And, your parallel makes it sound like you believe that there's some way in which Devorah is sort of trying to meld herself in order to be heard. It's the exact opposite.
I'm just asking about, it's the fact of a person who doesn't have a critical mass. There's not a critical mass of other female
But she's got
prophets.
God. I mean, like, what do you mean she doesn't have a critical mass? She's got God, and she's seen as somebody who's got God. And the people actually, I mean, if Barak is to be an example of that, Barak comes to her because he believes that she has the godly blessing that would flow through her.
So can I just say, there's something fundamentally unsatisfying to me about this story, because to me, Torah is best when it can instruct us, when it can give us a lesson of, like, so I read Isaiah and I know that fasting on Yom Kippur is not enough. What am I going to do to be helpful to other people? When I read this story, so yes, she has God, and Barak listens to her, and she sits and listens and judges and doesn't berate, etc. But it's not clear to me from the story, like, how she got there, or what she did, or what moral quality I need to inculcate, or what moral quality I need to work on to be like Deborah. It just posits, here's a woman who's a prophet who connects with God, and so there's something about it that I don't know the answer to the question, what do I do to be like Deborah?
Michelle and I would both like to respond.
Yes.
I'll follow
you. So that bothers me a little bit to hear that, because first off, just because it's not explicitly stated doesn't mean there aren't lessons for how to be. And second off, I think she's modeling something that I think is more intangible and maybe even more important, which is listening to your inner voice and responding to your own connection to God. And everyone else is like, God told me I know what I'm doing, just do this thing. And like, she's like, I have a personal private relationship with God, and I go out and daven, and if you want to come, I'm happy to have a conversation with you, and I'm happy. My job is to help you uncover your greatest strengths. My job is to help you become the best that you can be. And in fact, when a war general comes to me, I'm going to say, you go do this war general thing. You've got it. I see it in you. You can be a hero. And he's like, but I'm afraid I can't go by myself. And she's like, fine, if you really need me to go, I can go with you, but just know you're not going to look as good. Like, it's not about her. It's about her connection with God, and it's about everyone else becoming their best selves. And that's, I think, to me, a much more powerful lesson than, like, take off the yoke of your suffering, and your fasting is not something I care about because I want you to do social justice, but not because of real social justice, but because I want you to see me as somebody who values social justice.
Yeah, and look, she earns the name Devorah, a mother in Israel. And I really see in exactly that move that Eliza is calling out a very motherly move, because what she's saying is, I see your future. I see your potential, and it's up to you to rise to that potential. And if you want, I'll go help you set up your dorm room, but dude, like...
So just to close this off and move on to Yael, what I hear in this, and I love this Perush, this interpretation, what I'm hearing is she's kind of like a prophetess therapist, right? In other words, she's a mirror with questions, and she invites the people who see her to figure out how they can become the best versions of themselves, and she supports them. So that's nice. Good. Okay.
I just have one last thing to
yes.
say. So the other thing is that the way the text is framed, it says, she was a prophetess in Israel. She led Israel at that time. It seems that this was not, the way that the text is framed is that this was not out of the ordinary, that women actually had leadership positions as well. So that's, that's a pashat that we're seeing, that, in a time that we think only of patriarchal, that it actually wasn't necessarily that.
Okay.
And that makes a difference also, I think.
Thank you, Dan.
Go
okay.
women.
Now, next comes Yael. And again, the same question, what's the lesson, the life lesson from Yael? So, Michelle, would you read on page 521, verse 17, Sisera, meanwhile, and just read that paragraph.
Sisera, meanwhile, had fled on foot to the tent of Yael, wife of Hever the Kenite. For there was friendship between King Yavin of Chazor and the family of Hever the Kenite. Yael came out to greet Sisera and said to him, "Come in, my lord. Come in here. Do not be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. He said to her, "Please let me have some water. I am thirsty." She opened a skin of milk and gave him some to drink, and she covered him again. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you if there's anybody here, say no." Then Yael, wife of Hever, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. When he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down to the ground. Thus he died.
And they lived happily ever after. So, question, is Yael here role modeling proper conduct? Is this okay? Is this okay? There's a Malcolm Gladwell on the same question. Is this okay?
This is a whole other level of, women being bound into the constraints of their world and using sort of what they have to get the job done. The Midrashic take here, of course, is that covering him with a blanket is about more than that.
Can we just pause there? Can we just pause there? If you didn't have, this is a yes. 2 quick questions, simple questions for the 3 of you. If you didn't have the midrash, would you say this is sexual?
Obviously.
Obviously.
Obviously, in its context,
Would
because
you not?
they call out that she's a wife, right? Actually, her title is that she's a wife. They give her a name, so it's not just she's like the wife of Noach, right? She actually has her own name in the text, and yet it is repeatedly pointed out her role as a wife, and therefore the transgressive nature of this moment.
I totally don't see this as sexual at all. Zero sex. Because, first of all, Sisera is famished. He's exhausted. He's on the run. And he's thirsty.
Can you not have sex when you're famished and exhausted?
No, Maslow's hierarchy. If I'm thirsty, I'm starving, I'm on the run, and my world is collapsing, I'm not thinking about sex. I'm really not. So where's the sex?
It's biblical,
Dan, Lord Nesson, where's the sex?
It's biblical, phraseology.
Go for it. Where?
You find it, back at the beginning of Bereshit with Noach and his sons. Right?
But we're not talking about that. We're
Thank
talking
you for
about
leaving
Yael.
It's exactly that. It's exactly that. The
idiom.
uncovering of Ham of.
Yeah. In other words, the idiom of covering over is a clear, very ancient use of language saying this is a sexual act.
And
Think
Dan,
about-
thank you
So
for
that's what it
lifting
is.
the level of our conversation again.
And also yes. And also we have Ruth and Boaz, right?
Right.
That whole episode with their covering and uncovering, and it very carefully mentions just feet, but not anything. And then you have also the double, I think here the milk is also a sexual theme. It's not, that is not just a skin of milk.
Right. And it's something.
All right, can I just? I'm almost 60 years old, and I missed something.
So
Where
you
did
can
milk become sexualized?
You can be
Where?
with the,
What am I missing?
Wes, you can be with the rabbis. There is a rabbinic voice. There is a rabbinic voice that works really hard to say that she was above reproach and there's nothing sexual here and don't look, nothing to see here, folks. Go away. There is
Yeah,
that
I'm with
rabbinic
them.
voice. You can be with them.
Well, she murders him. That's a separate issue.
That
But I don't see
said,
that she sleeps with him.
That said, the actual midrashic voice who says that it is sexual spends a lot of time arguing that this is an example of a transgression done for the sake of a mitzvah. And is that okay? And they use Yael exactly as a model of is it okay to be sinning?
I'm
if
with
you're
you,
on
but the
path to
transgression at
mitzvah?
issue is driving a tent peg through the guy's forehead.
But
the
that the
transgression
rabbis
is
didn't.
killing him,
But
not-
actually, that the rabbis didn't see as a sin at all, because that's killing the enemy.
There's
Okay,
also a part-
okay. So
The mitzvah is killing him. The transgression on the way to the mitzvah is bringing him into your tent and covering him.
And he's also a familiar person. It's very careful to say he's a family friend. Like, he has access to their home on a regular. Like, they've built up this connection. It's not that he's there's history.
Right. By the way, Wes, if you look, so the person who brings this is Rashi, who says, who consorted with Sisera in order to weaken him so that she would be able to slay him. So Rashi's not on your team.
There's also this is like there's also the biblical phraseology of bringing into the tent. When bringing into the tent is also a way of saying, I'm not gonna say.
Adult things. Can I go to the tent peg for a second? Because there's
yes.
something that's always really
Yes.
struck me about this, literally struck, but about this murder, because that driving a tent peg through someone's head with a mallet is not like, the text is very careful to say she snuck up on him. And I'm like, that's all well and good. But once you snuck up on him, you got to position the tent peg and then bash it into his brain several times until it goes to the ground. Like, that's not, like, how do you keep him still? Like, it's not a very practical, that's not a practical murder weapon. It's not also like, how tired is he? There's a lot that's really strange in this text.
And what's the meaning you make of the mallet of the tent
Well,
peg?
I actually think that this goes to Yael being a superhero. Like, I actually think that, like, that's superhuman strength and
She's Gal
superhuman.
Gadot. She's Wonder Woman.
Exactly. Like, there's something it's not right. She doesn't have ordinary weapons at her disposal, but she becomes extraordinary. Like, her strength and her power in that moment exceed what you would expect of her.
Yeah, and in that way, using the tent peg, which is what is available to her at that time. She doesn't have a cache of weapons lying around. It's not that her normal job is to be a warrior. She takes what she has in that space, and she's able to rise with a level of energy and a level of strength and courage and resilience to be able to get this deed done. By the way, she also is able to quickly be decisive. And I think one of the things that many people struggle with is decisiveness and being able to look around you and utilize what the resources you have to deal with the situation you face. And if you're asking about what kind of a role model she is,
Yes.
she's a role model of actually being able to work with what you have in order to accomplish something that's not easy.
Last question here before we leave this reading. So far, we don't see eye to eye on anything, but that's all good. What could you just explain? What's the business? I've never understood this story. I want water. She gives him milk. So we now have the sexualized milk, which I got to figure that one out. But what's like? He wants water because I'm thirsty. It's the desert. He's running. When you're thirsty, you don't want to drink milk. When you're thirsty, you want to drink water or seltzer, but not milk. So, but she gives him milk. What is that? Just at the pshat level.
The midrash. Oh, I can't.
Pshat level. What's the pshat? What's the pshat? Lord
I can give you
Nesson, what's the
midrash.
pshat?
I think there's a potential for pshat in that now we don't have this in the text, but if you're putting something else, if you're putting something in the milk or the water, like, it's a lot harder to hide a flavor of something in water than it is in milk. And also, I don't know this from experience, but I have read about this in books, and other people have said that, like, warm milk is very tiring for
Yes.
you just.
She's trying to get him to sleep. Right. I think that's it.
Correct.
Like, if you have warm milk, that makes you sleepy.
Right.
So, okay, but the moral lesson here, not to be reductionist, is use what you have and act decisively.
Certainly, I think one core message that you
Okay.
could get from her example.
Okay, so we have Deborah as kind of the listening, empathetic therapist who helps you be your best self. You have Yael, who uses what she has at her disposal and acts decisively. And then you have the mother of Sisera. So if you'll turn to page 527, and Dan, if you could read, I think, start reading with verse 24. Before the mother of Sisera paragraph, this is very artistic. You have the narrator of the poem telling you what actually happened, and meanwhile, while that's happening, you have the mother of Sisera. So if you'll read from 24 through 31.
Most blessed of women be Yael, wife of Heber and the Kenite, most blessed of women in tents. He asked for water, she offered milk. In a princely bowl she brought him curds. Her left hand reached for the tent pin, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, crushed his head, smashed and pierced his temple. And at her feet he sank, lay outstretched. At her feet he sank, lay still. Where he sank, there he lay, destroyed. Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she whined. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why so late the clatter of his wheels? The wisest of her ladies gave answer. She too replies to herself, they must be dividing the spoil they have found. A damsel or two for each man. Spoil of dyed cloths for Sisera. Spoil of embroidered clothes. A couple of embroidered cloths round every neck as spoil. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but may his friends be as the sun rising in might, and the land was tranquil for 40 years.
Oh, my God. This is just so inexpressibly powerful to me. What is going on in this brief paragraph about the mother of Sisera? What's going on here? This is why, by the way, we study Bible, because it gets to the deepest truths of the human condition. What you just read, Dan, the deepest truths of the human condition. Eliza, what's going on with this?
So I think what's going on with this is that you have the truth, which is that you have a hardened criminal who does all sorts of wrongdoing in the world, who's still adored and loved by his mother, and whose mother can't see anything bad about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, not only that, she's proud of him.
I was trying to avoid that, but yes.
Proud of him.
Yes.
Right.
And she's consoled. She wonders, where's my son? And the women say, don't worry, he's just out raping.
Right.
He's just out pillaging. You know, let Sisera be Sisera. A little rape, a little pillage, a little plunder, a little cloth embroidery. He'll be home soon. And she says, you're right. Thank God. Right? So what's, oh my God, that's just like pulsating. What do you do with that?
I think actually Sisera's mother represents both sort of the ultimate truth of being a parent, which is we love our kids no matter what, and whatever they're doing, we find a way to rationalize, right? I mean, there's so many ways in which we kind of twist and warp our sense of the world in order to make our children the heroes of our story, even today. And in that way, she also then becomes a cautionary tale, because it's very easy as a parent to buy into cultural constructs that enable our children to really become people who we would not otherwise be proud of. And I think we have to watch ourselves for that, Sisera's mother's instinct.
Yeah, I want to just double click on what you said, Michelle, because what implicit in what you said is it's possible to read this as this is a war criminal's mother, this is Mussolini's mother, this is Hitler's mother, this is some, war criminal's mother, and therefore it's sui generis to war criminals and their mothers. And the rabbinic move is the opposite, that this is not a war criminal's mother, this is a mother. And this is not for sui generis, this is universal. And the way that we know this, and this is just so powerful. I just love being Jewish. This is just so powerful. The Hebrew word for Sisera's mother's whining is yevava. She's moaning, oh, where's my son, where's my son, yevava. And when the Talmud in the tractate Rosh Hashanah asks, what should the sound of a tekiah sound like, the plaintive sound of a tekiah, the answer is the yevava of Sisera's mother. So here it is on Rosh Hashanah, and what should we be thinking about? Blind love. What do we not see? What do we not see about ourselves because we love ourselves? What do we not see about our loved ones because we love our loved ones? And and that the sound of the shofar should pierce through our blind spots.
I think the other thing is that there's an assumption that Sisera's a war criminal. He's to the people that he's for whom he's a military leader, he's a war hero. So I think
Right.
I think so. Yeah. So
and
in other
you-
words, we're making an assumption because he's our enemy that he's bad, but for them he's good.
By the way, this is so resonant for our time because, a large part of the country looks at the insurrectionists as insurrectionists. They should go to jail, right? But the insurrectionists look at the insurrectionists as heroes. They're heroes, right? So you have the same, right? Part of the country thinks terrible, jail, this is democracy under assault. The other part thinks wonderful, this is courage, this is moral virtue, freeing the country. And so there's something very disquieting about the fact that there's no such a thing as a fact. It's thinking that makes it so. She actually thinks her son is a hero. The reader knows that her son is not a hero, but she and her whole town, the whole community that he represents and comes from, right? And that was true then, and that is hauntingly true now. Michelle?
I think it's so powerful for our modern world and also so challenging for us because, of course, one of the things in the modern world that we come to understand is that everyone is the hero of their own story. And that means that we grapple with sort of cultural relativism and how much do I understand your motivations for thinking and believing the way that you do versus how much do I say, no, there's an ultimate truth and you can't just make yourself the hero of your story if you're out raping and pillaging.
Right. So it's so interesting. We're doing T.E. Reads this week, and we're doing Lord Jonathan Sachs's book, Morality. And the chapter we're focusing on is post-truth, and how there's post-truth means there's no such thing as truth. It's all depends on your point of view. And it turns out that's a very old problem. This is post-truth. Because we would say to Aim Sisera, your son Sisera is raping people, he's a war criminal. She would say, no, my son Sisera is a hero liberating the land for the Canaanites. And post-truth is as old as the Bible. I just want to ask a concluding question because I know, Aliza, you got to get to the sanctuary to get ready for this beautiful musical service. How does this coterie of actors, Deborah, the prophetess, Yael, who does what she does, and the mother of Sisera, how do this whole story and those three figures figure into the broader theme of Shabbat Shira? And how does it connect with our Torah portion? That's always a traditional question. How does the Haftarah connect with the Torah? How does the Haftarah connect with the Torah?
So I wanted to speak to the three women because I think that there's all three of these women are motivated by an inner truth. You're talking about post-truth, but I think they're all really motivated from their deep inner sense of what's right. And we have two tales of when what your inner sense of what is right matches what his outer sense of what is right is, and one tale where what your inner sense of what is right does not match an outer sense of what is right. And so it feels like as we move out of slavery, as we move towards a liberated world, we have to have that sense of listening to our own hearts and listening to our own sense of self, but having the awareness that our inner sense might not always be right, and we need other people, we need other community members to help us make sure that we're always on the right track.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm thinking of just some of the technical stuff. Like, for instance, you have the Egyptian chariots, and then in this story you have the 900 chariots of Sisera. So you have that connection. You have the poem the poem of Devorah, which is structurally the same style as the Shirat Hayam. So that's the connection. You also the other woman that we're kind of leaving aside is Miriam, right? Who also who sang to God also. So we have that continual connection of the importance of women in the whole story of the development of the Jewish people, as a people and our connection to God.
That's Beautiful, Dan. I would actually say that the Song of the Sea, it might tempt us to believe that redemption is a one-time thing and that God does redemption when God is good and ready to do it. And we can only receive that and sing with grace. The Song of Devorah helps us realize that redemption is ongoing and we can be a part of it.
And I would just add to all that and to build on that, Michelle, that song and joy never comes from an easy template. Song and joy never comes from a picnic in the park where the sun is shining and the wind is gentle and there's some purple tulips blooming and you sing a song of the sea. But in both of these cases, what happened was massive suffering and massive trepidation and massive vulnerability. The Song of the Sea came because they thought they were all going to die. The heroism of Yael happened in the case of this terrible war with a fierce general. And I think that, again, the theme here of Shabbat Shira is there's bad news and good news. The bad news is the vulnerability always comes with. There's no perfect day in the park. But the good news is that even in the presence of vulnerability, we can still sing. Shabbat Shalom. And speaking of singing, we will
Shabbat
all
Shalom.
see you at 9:30 for a truly beautiful Shabbat service.